Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this conversation that we are hosting to commemorate um, Privacy Day 2026. The title of our event is Why Africa Needs Data Embassies. My name is Fola Adeleke. I am the Executive Director for the Global Center on AI Governance. And joining us today is Ridwan Oloyede, who is a co-founder of Tech Hive Advisory, a leading think tank in Nigeria that specializes in data protection, as well as Alison Tilley, who until recently was one of the regulators for the information protection regulator in South Africa. Alison, is a leading figure in shaping South Africa's data protection landscape. She was one of the um, early you know, drafters of the data protection law of South Africa before it went on to Parliament and was ultimately adopted. Some of you may have heard of the Open Democracy Advice Center, which really led the work in influencing the adoption of access to information laws and data protection laws across the continent from the early 2000s onwards. And Alison is the name behind that initiative. Today's conversation essentially has been informed by a recent paper that was written by Ridwan Oloyede and his colleagues titled Beyond Borders: Exploring Data Embassies as a Strategy for Digital Sovereignty in Africa. In Africa, it is estimated that 95% of the continent's data is hosted outside Africa. And this external reliance exposes African states to various vulnerabilities, from jurisdictional and privacy risks to latency and access issues. But many African governments, especially African ministers, have been speaking increasingly about this idea of digital sovereignty. But the unavailability of local infrastructure, particularly the severe shortage of data centers and cloud capacity, certainly affects the realization of this objective. So African digital sovereignty needs a reimagining from the territorial localization of data to strategic fusion of legal control, infrastructural pragmatism, and regional cooperation. To adopt a continental data governance approach that achieves data interoperability both in technical and legal terms, data embassies offer a practical mechanism for building digital sovereignty while promoting, for example, a cloud-first approach in Africa. And this idea of digital sovereignty really has taken an ambiguous meaning as states develop national strategies and priorities that morph the idea of asserting ownership and control over digital infrastructure and protecting the data of citizens within its borders and subject to national frameworks. The ambition of states, however, is being tempered with the reality of infrastructure deficits, like I mentioned earlier, where countries without in-country data centers rely on routing their data to other data centers globally. In 2025, African Union member states adopted the Declaration on AI, which endorsed the idea of regional infrastructure as a means to limit infrastructural dependency through distributed sovereign compute infrastructure that supports all regions of the continent. But even in countries viewed as digitally progressive, like in Kenya, the burden of building and maintaining large-scale infrastructure often requires heavy reliance on foreign capital and partnerships, which can dilute the intended goals of digital sovereignty. For example, in Kenya, Microsoft announced a while back that they are going to have a $1 billion investment package that will support the Microsoft Azure East Cloud region. But this project has stalled around because of the availability of energy sources to power a data center and may potentially utilize a third of the national grid capacity of Kenya and the data volume necessary to fully maximize this facility. These examples show a broad dilemma. Sovereignty concerns are often symbolic, and their operationalization is actually a distant reality. This is further exemplified by the recent agreement between the Kenyan government and to complete a bilateral agreement with the United States to grant the US direct priority access to pathogen data in return for health aid. I recognize that a Kenyan High Court has since suspended this bilateral agreement. Overall, data embassies are meant to offer an alternative way beyond the dilemma of limited infrastructure capacity and fragmented regulatory regimes for cross-border data flows. Rather than each nation needing to shoulder the full financial and technical burden of top-tier data centers for sovereignty, countries can pool resources and leverage, their friendly neighbors who have this infrastructure. African states are trying to build their own cloud infrastructure, but a country that already has relatively advanced facilities could, for example, host backups for others under a legal arrangement that preserves the client country's jurisdiction over its data. So this approach potentially reframes digital sovereignty not as each nation keeping its own data within its own borders, but as a collective project on resilience where nations trust each other to hold data on their behalf securely. Obviously, you will start realizing that achieving this though could
Of
potentially be hard in
researchers
practice
with different level of
because such arrangements do not diminish sovereignty because the data remains legally under the origin's control. But while it is meant to enhance sovereignty, you have some, challenges in relation to under which kind of legal arrangements are you going to be transferring data from one country to the next, you know. So looking more broadly, data embassy agreements could potentially be established at the regional bloc level, where you're looking at, for example, the SADC or East African communities facilitating a multilateral treaty where member states designate or build a joint data center for all member states. The African Union could establish a data embassy where each, is partitioned and governed by the respective state laws. But all of this, sound theoretically possible, and we have global case studies in Estonia and Saudi Arabia that are trialing this. But I think it's important to have a conversation around, well, what are some of the challenges of implementing this idea of data embassies? And, what kind of legal mechanisms do we need to start thinking about? What is the role of a national, data protection authority in facilitating this kind of transfers, in exercising oversight over this kind of data? And that is why we have, two experts today to lead us in this conversation. And Ridwan Oloyede, who, like I mentioned earlier, really was his paper was the one that triggered this conversation we're having today. Welcome. And I would like us to start us off by looking at this idea of data in the first place as a strategic asset. It is increasingly being treated as a critical national infrastructure for security, for economic competitiveness, for AI development. But what substantive changes in governance, in investments, in institutional design are necessary for African states to exercise real control over their data ecosystems rather than just symbolic ownership?
Thank you so much for the introduction, and of course, giving a background to the work we did on the concept of data embassy paper. And just to add a bit of more nuances that right after this paper, we've been able to, I mean, it's stirring a lot of conversation in different parts of the world. Our colleagues in Latin America are also having this conversation, and they've been engaging different governments on the possibility of actually looking at data embassy. And generally, we also seen India, UAE earlier this year, Bahrain and Cyprus also enter into similar agreements. Estonia, Luxembourg has really provided that template or that symbolic template for what this could look like. But the thing about what it is currently or how things currently is that what we found in our research is that the concept of symbolic ownership of data, because which is where the conversation typically starts. Countries want to own their data, how we all differently or distinctly interpret the concept of data sovereignty. But often than not, in Africa, these are typically manifested in very strict data localization requirements. But the disconnect with strict localization requirements sometimes is the fact that the infrastructure doesn't exist to keep the data locally. And we can go into some examples of a few countries where laws, the data protection law goes as far back as 2016, early 2000s, that says data must be stored locally. But the capacity of the data centers in that market is not enough to actually service the market. So technically, they created a situation where it's practically impossible to comply with those laws. So now, I think another thing next to that conversation about symbolic ownership is also a lot of conversation that is floating around the idea of harmonization of laws. And sometimes harmonization is typically framed as having identical laws. And I think as a continent, we need to reframe that conversation. Rather than having identical laws, what we rather need is identical outcomes. Identical outcomes means coalition of willing. Let's take Malabo Convention as an example. It took so long before the draft itself was finally, was finalized. Then from being finalized in 2014 to full ratification, it took almost a decade. And that's what consensus has tried to do, historically has shown us. It's been stagnation. So how do we then move? So we started looking at the idea of if data embassy could be a whole workaround. And maybe later in the course of the conversation, I'll also talk about how even the big conversation around cross-border data transfer, how the concept of data embassy could also be an alternative. The continent has been looking at different ways to reimagine cross-border data transfer, and it's one of those things in policy circle where the conversation is happening. But just to get a good hang of this conversation. So when it comes to governance, one thing that we've seen, and maybe the African Continental Free Trade Agreement provides also is an interesting template, is sometimes it is very difficult for all the countries on the continent to agree on how it's going to work. So, and which is why I said it's very important for us to reimagine what we mean when we say harmonization. So for governance, the priority definitely has to be countries who are willing to ball together, establishing that framework. And when it comes to what the framework should look like, the framework should be that we are trying to build what I would describe as a corridor of trust. So country A recognizes country B, maybe let's say Rwanda and Ghana, for example, who has also provided us an interesting example of how countries can actually work together. And the idea is while we're building that room for corridor of what we describe as trust, we are also ensuring that the data still remains under the full legal custody of the transferring country or the country that's using whether a neighboring country or a different country as the host for the data. Because again, the whole idea of data embassy is pretty much physical embassy, enjoying that same immunity and, and all of that. So, and it also has to be framed in such a way that, of course, there are challenges, there are fears that are inherent, there's historical mistrust. But the agreement is also framed in such a way that the law of the host country cannot override that of the country that is hosting in it. In terms of investment, definitely, whether we're looking at shared infrastructure model, whether we're looking at co-building, co-location model, whatever it is, one thing is clear. Building a standard tier 4 data center, for example, it's expensive. It's prohibitively expensive, which sometimes it's not national priorities of many countries. Whether you're also able to secure the investment to also build it, it's also not always, because again, business interests would definitely be driven by commercial possibility of being able to scale. So when we're looking at this as well, the investment bits, whether we're talking about sovereignty sharing, whatever it is model, it is the fact that when we build, again, the emphasis is on building a rail for corridor for trust, is that the country who is also hosting uniquely hosts the technical capacity that makes it impossible for the host country to go into. And we've seen, quite a number of times historically where, embassies have also been violated and all of that, yes. But technically, it's practically impossible to get around it. So that also has to be baked into the agreement. So even if you go into the data center and you take, the facilities, you still can have access to the data. Then I think the last bit is around what institutional design should look like. Again, if we are going to say country and country B needs to work together, then we also need a joint oversight mechanism that allows, the visiting country or the host country, for example, the possibility to audit, to ensure, they have no violation. There's that periodic review to ensure everyone is sticking to the terms of the hosting arrangement and all of that. So the key thing here is that the conversation is not a commercial one, it's a diplomatic one, and it needs to be seen exactly in that context. So just to wrap it up, essentially, it's that, again, the problem data embassies are trying to solve is the same historical one that has not really helped us to move the needle from where we are to where we need to be. And it's just one of those mechanisms fraught with its own challenges. But also, what we're also seeing is there are also workarounds around these challenges. So essentially, that's how we're thinking when we're writing the paper.
Thank you, Ridwan. What you just mentioned about what we need are not identical laws, but identical outcomes. It's something that Alison was echoed in the meeting of African Data Protection Authorities in Abuja last year. I recall that the acting chair, the Kenya Data Protection Regulator, mentioned, harmonization that should not equal identical laws. So we certainly have a regulatory paradox here, where across the continent, ambitious sovereignty and localization frameworks coexist with, what Ridwan has described as limited infrastructure but also weak enforcement capacity. So from a legal and governance perspective, does this gap risk undermining trust in national data governance systems?
I think the answer is yes, it does. Although I think we are putting a lot of different things into one basket, it may be useful to just maybe separate them out a little bit. Obviously, my framework as a data protection authority regulator would give me a particular view on what data we're talking about. So we're talking about personal data. And I think what is not necessarily considered properly is what the nature of personal data is. Is it in fact property? Because that seems to be the way people think about data. It's something that's capable of being owned. I'm not sure that personal information, personal data can be owned in that way. And once you question that, I think the whole idea of who owns data becomes more problematic. And you then have to think about, particularly with cross-border flows, you have to think about it really more as a rights issue. And when you start thinking about a rights issue, that you're then looking at individuals having rights in relation to particular jurisdictions, not just your home jurisdiction, but others, having access to regulators who can uphold those rights, having access to courts, and in those different fora, being able to exercise rights like correction or your right to objection. And I think if you are starting to think about it like that, it doesn't mean the data embassies don't make sense as an idea. It just means, I think, that you have to think you have to disaggregate the data that you're thinking about. And one of the most frustrating things that's ever been said is that data is the new oil. Because I think governments across the world were like, well, if it's the new oil, we better own it and we better manage it, and it's better be something we're in charge of. And of course, whatever kinds of data, personal and otherwise, of course they're valuable. But because they're valuable doesn't mean that they're objects that are capable of being owned. So I think that sort of fundamental sort of conceptual level, if you're going to start moving beyond that and start thinking about whether, we actually can, meet these kinds of data sovereignty frameworks, if you do have issues with infrastructure, limited enforcement capacity, uneven enforcement capacity, a fragmented regulatory system with different jurisdictions having different laws. I think there's a more fundamental question to be asked. If you had to say to me, what would the sort of next step be, I would say harmonization is a very interesting way of moving forward, and that I think is something that certainly there's a lot of discussion about. And what's nice about harmonization is you can look at 2 or 3 jurisdictions at a time. You don't have to look at the whole world, so you don't have to do a GDPR for everybody. As long as me and my next door neighbors agree that we're all more or less on the same page, then that might well be good enough and create the kind of ease of movement that you really want, where it's balanced with keeping data safe. So I think perhaps I have some sort of prior questions that I'm trying to answer when sort of addressing the question of sovereignty.
Thank you, Alison. Ridwan, you finished the conversation earlier by saying, well, this conversation is not a commercial one, but a diplomatic one, right? And in your paper, you gave an interesting example about, bilateral trust building, such as the growing digital cooperation between Ghana and Rwanda. I would like you to speak a little more about this example and, reflect on what would it take to translate these kinds of arrangements into scalable regional models under continental frameworks under the AU.
I mean, if you look at what's happening, the whole digital cooperation between Rwanda and Ghana, and the model its birth is take the licensing passporting model. So it simply means you get a license in Ghana or Rwanda, you can go into any of those countries to basically run with that same license, rather than going through the full spectrum, applying for license all over, which is actually like a problem for scaling on the continent. Every country, even within some countries, every subnational body, for those who are in the gaming industry, for example, they know that every subnational unit have different licensing regime and fees. So what the passport licensing model was seen between Ghana and Rwanda is like, you basically can have a Rwandan approved license to maybe as a fintech player, maybe as a payment processor, and you can go to Ghana and work with the same licensing. So that's exactly that kind of example where, we extrapolated and say, okay, we're actually seeing that model. But it's not just that, you're also seeing, a lot of work among some regional bodies. The EAC, for example, is working on a data governance framework and also working on a framework that will allow free flow of data between member states. ECOWAS is doing a significant modification to the Supplementary Data Protection Act that is also meant to create a workaround around cross-border data transfer issue. There's a whole lot of conversation happening at SADC level as well. So the point here is, if we need to export these examples and some of these smaller examples you're seeing come up within different countries who are signing all sort of agreements. We're also seeing even authorities in countries or agencies signing agreements between themselves and the authorities in other countries under the international cooperation mechanism framework. So if we need this to work within the again, within the concept of data embassy, then it means as far as the African Union is concerned, it can't treat what we are seeing as a trend emerging as an exception. Rather, they are they are pilots for what could be for the continent. And a lot of, references made to the Estonia and Luxembourg model, but it only works because the treaty that exists between these countries says the physical immunity that embassies enjoy under the Vienna Convention will apply to a data embassy as well. So for us to scale this concept on the continent, we know again, consensus is stagnation. We can get the 50 plus countries, for example, to sign bilateral treaties between themselves. What we need the African Union to do, or what will be expected, is creating what would look, or what we can describe as a standard protocol on what digital immunities look like, or what immunity would look like in a digital context. And this is something that, for example, can be annexed to. There's a significant work being done, for example, on reviewing the Malabo Convention. Is this something we can ascribe to it? Whether as an annexure or some sort of like an additional protocol. Is this something we want to bring under, also extend maybe the digital trade protocol under the African Free Trade Agreement? Where we basically say, cyber immunities work between member states. That's one thing. There is also what you call the multilateral resilience, where the conversation should transcend beyond just bilateral cooperation or conversation to multilateral conversation. So if, for example, Mauritania, Madagascar, Seychelles decide to say, you know what, we're going to have this arrangement between ourselves. But as part of having this arrangement between ourselves and also to guarantee trust objectively, we all have to also keep like backups or like an encrypted version of this data or fraction of this data, such that if something goes south somewhere, something stopped working, we literally can still get back working without being held back by a technical problem. So I guess the big question is then, how do we scale this? And that's why, again, scaling means we need to reimagine the conversation beyond, just bilateral conversation or reciprocity to then talking about multilateral resilience, which means in as much as we're trusting ourselves, we're also, having backup embedded within that framework such that even if technically something stops working, we can literally get back up. And I'll say this last thing is, typically when we float the idea of conversation around localization, different countries have different motives. But I was reading something recently and I was learning about our localization provision in Rwanda, for example. One of the motivation is like latency because it's landlocked and it's not close to so you see also countries who have such motivations, and this really presents like an interesting example to basically just walk around some of this, challenges that could be a problem. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ridwan. Yes, in a current project that we are working on, we interviewed Rwandan policymakers, and they made the point you just made that the reason why they abandoned a cloud first policy approach in Rwanda was because of one, geographical reasons, the fact that they're landlocked and they don't want their data being essentially held hostage in neighboring countries, but also because of the US Cloud Act, which essentially allows the United States to access the data of other countries if they are utilizing any US company, if they're utilizing the infrastructure of any US company. Alison, so you were very careful in your earlier remarks to, kind of distinguish personal data from other types of data. And the reality is, the mandate of data protection authorities is essentially, limited to personal data. And data embassies is meant to deal with, all categories of data, really. So if models such as data embassies become more prominent, what kind of new responsibilities would fall on domestic regulators and courts? And are most legal systems in Africa currently equipped for that level of cross-border complexity?
Mm. Well, I mean, I think that one of the, as you say, one of the difficulties is this question of is it possible to disaggregate the personal data and keep it in some nice clean box somewhere while all the other data is used, and of course the answer is no. I think that one of the things that we do know is that if you're going to have a system of governance of data, that it all tends to be put together. And I'm not sure that data protection authorities are really thinking about how it is that they will have to do this going forward. I think what does seem to me, coming from the world of cross-border data flows, that there are a number of different systems that are sort of being promoted internationally. And I think one that there is a lot of interest in is looking at certification of data flows, which are then approved by an accountability agent, which is created by the scheme. And the accountability agent can be the data protection authority itself, or can be another body. It can even be a for-profit company in that framework. And I think what that then tries to do is to say, from a data protection authority point of view, you don't try and deal with entire jurisdictions of data. So you wouldn't say that you're dealing with data sovereignty of Lesotho and you want to now try and deal with everything there. That what you would then try and do is get people who are moving data across borders to really reach a point where the authority can then certify that data flow meets the criteria and is then suitable, that you can then regard it as being safe, and you can make the transfer. And it does seem to me that where we are, a lot of this is very theoretical, and it doesn't necessarily, I'm not sure that it would give me a lot of confidence in relation to my own data. I think that if I know that the company that I'm working with in jurisdiction A and the transfer to the company in jurisdiction B is certified in terms of those criteria, that then allows you to have a high degree of trust in that transfer. I'm not sure that the difficulties of working at a national level, where you're looking at whole jurisdictions, I think they run into all the problems we were talking about earlier. And I think it becomes, it really becomes too theoretical. Whereas if you can work in a more local way, just if you're looking at sort of an adequacy determination, you really can't find a whole country adequate. It's just a nonsense. It's a figment of our imaginations that can happen. It is possible to say that in a particular industry, that adequacy is possible. Adequacy, I don't think. Also, the other problem is over time. Especially in areas where the rule of law is under challenge. A transfer that works this year may not be to a jurisdiction where there is adequate protection in 5 years' time. So it's a lot more flexible. And I think that those are the things that, for me, I think that that's where I think data protection authorities might well find that they can provide the kinds of, getting redress, where it is possible to investigate processing, and where it's possible to put evidence in front of a court. Because if you can't do that, then what is your enforcement structure? And that then seems to me that would give me more comfort than trying to, look at a scalable continental model, because I just don't think that's a stable thing over time. And I think that that's something that that we have to look at in adequacy findings, is that, the fact that the rule of law continues to exist in a particular jurisdiction is an important part of a conversation. So that would seem to me where the data protection line, the protections work are more effective, which seems to me, my argument would then take me to the point that I then say, well, then probably, these big interjurisdictional systems maybe is maybe not the most pragmatic answer. I'm a great pragmatist.
Indeed, thank you. Ridwan, you framed your entire paper on the necessity of the data embassies around its ability to promote digital sovereignty. Now, the essential concern, though, is that embassies could maybe just potentially shift dependency from hyperscale tech providers to host states. So how will you do with that? What kind of legal, technical, and governance safeguards will be essential for this model to be credible in practice?
I mean, of course, it's I think it's like, if not the biggest, it's one of the biggest risk when you're looking at, this kind of model, because again, you decide to lean on a neighboring country, and all of a sudden, I mean, if you look at the Sahel belt, for example, a coup happens, a whole political shift, a change in power, the government comes on, do like previous policies. We've seen that happen quite a number of times. So we've essentially traded, one vulnerability with another vulnerability. But the key thing we argued is being able to entrench deeply the concept of, diplomatic inviolability. And I know this really means nothing when you're probably having to deal with a government that is not, that decide not to have respect for these boundaries. But in our thinking, the case we made is, for example, whether it's a treaty, whether it's an agreement between countries, there should always be the expropriation clause baked into this. And this is basically saying data seizure by all states is considered as an act of aggression. Actually, but then these arguments will again fall apart if you're talking with the old states, there is a stronger military power. I mean, you simply can't do anything. Stronger military power, stronger economic power. Again, it falls apart, and we recognize that limitation. But again, another thing we also said was that we also need like a binding dispute resolution clause that definitely would take the dispute mechanism away from the host states. It has to be hosted in a neutral territory, for example. And it doesn't fall under the domain of the domestic court, of course, which means when there's like a problem, we are not having to deal with a domestic court, which of course could also be compromised, or basically just doing the bidding of the power of the host states. But again, in thinking around this, in as much as, data embassy is, we're saying it's something we're using to build a corridor of trust, but you also go from the cybersecurity concept of zero trust architecture in thinking about it. So you have to imagine from the get-go that these states, even though we have historically ties, could also become hostile at any point for any reasons that, variables you're not in control of. So what the zero trust approach would look like is that, even though the data center, the hardware sits physically in the host state, technically logical access and, cryptographically is impossible. So even if you have the data, you have the data center right under your nose, you can't do anything with it. And you can basically just think around the concept of encryption. Again, this may fall apart with the kind of progress, we're also seeing with technologies like quantum computing. So that's one thing we're also thinking around in the in the way we're imagining the conversation. So again, the other thing again is nobody should just be able to flip the switch and basically say quote unquote digitally kidnapping the data or the data center, for example. So another thing we're saying around is, again, the technical solution. Is it possible to, which is why we're saying, in as much as you can trust the country, but can you also have bits and bits in places where you can also like restore backups and, you basically don't let things crumble or basically become a victim of a state. But I know this also like, then looking at what's the whole idea of data embassy identity, this is also increasing cost. But you have to think about this. You have to think about this instability. You have to think about these variables that are not in anyone's control, at least not in the control of how the conversation was imagined by the agreement or the treaty was being agreed on. And also the concept of data embassy sits on so many dependencies, economic stability, political stability, which again could flip and switch at any point in time. So again, these limitations is as much as we're excited about what this concept could look like, these limitations are also real. And it's important to also think about them from the get-go, which is why beyond governance, which of course you can bake into agreement and agreements can say anything, you also need to also think around the technical workaround such that even if anything happens, you don't get locked out or jammed out of your own data itself.
Mm, mm, mm.
Thank you for that, Ridwan. And it brings me back to the point you were making earlier, Alison, about adequacy. And a lot of data protection laws in Africa have different mechanisms for data transfers that are different. And so when you have different criteria for transfer of data, one relying on adequacy, others relying on consent, some relying on certification from a data protection authority. It makes cross-border data governance clearly complicated and fragmented and creates what everyone just spoke about in terms of uneven technical capacity as well. So, I mean, how serious a barrier is this in practice, and how do we deal with the point earlier made around, well, we shouldn't look at regulation harmonization, but maybe we should look at identical outcomes instead.
Mm. I mean, I think what's interesting in some ways is that it seems, I don't know, it seems sometimes that although cross-border flows are one of the things that take up a lot of airtime in terms of people writing and thinking and talking about it, but it's also one of the things we seem to do with absolute abandon. We will sign things, enter into agreements, and those will result in massive data flows. And it seems to me that a lot of the attorneys who work in the space are working on the basis that they're kind of crossing their fingers, because they're really just hoping that a number of different things will hold up, so that the firstly, just that security will hold up. There won't be a major data breach, that they will, they'll be able to transfer the data without losing the data. so there's a lot of assumptions built in, and so I think that while there is a lot of fragmentation, I think they just try and find the best set of workarounds they can. And that's often using standard contractual clauses, which I think we use in a way that it's not really how they were developed in the EU. So we don't use standard contractual clauses that are authorized by the regulator. We just use contractual clauses that creates a contractual nexus, so that if there's a problem, you then rely on a contractual remedy rather than anything else. And I mean, that's certainly, that's a way to go, but it doesn't really answer the question of, is there an adequate regulatory framework? Because you're almost trying to substitute a private sector contractual option where you feel that there isn't a nation state adequate option. I think harmonization is probably, in the systems that are looking at recognizing other systems, we're really looking, I think the concept, the founding concept was adequacy. I think that the idea of harmonization is recognizing that you can get less than 100% and still be adequate, that you can do that. But as I said, I'm not sure that the adequacy approach is really moving fast enough and is clear enough and gives you the right protections at the right time in relation to the right data. It again tries to take a very broad systemic approach. And I'm not sure that's, I'm not sure that really is the most effective way of dealing with these things. If you do want to go that way, do want to look at some kind of harmonization, I think working within a particular geographical entity or a group of countries, that makes most sense to me, because then you can look where there really is this high degree of overlap. But if you're going to take it beyond that, I think that's really starting to fall back into these very broad categorizations. And that's where I think the certification mechanisms provide more pragmatic systems which have remedies. Because ultimately, if a law without a remedy, you're supposed to work on the basis that ibi jus ubi remedium, right? You've got to have a remedy, and I think that the certification systems are better at providing that. Once you're outside of the EU, I think that would be my, it would change perhaps if we were sitting in the EU, but we indeed are not. So, I think looking at what really works for the human rights of the people of Africa is what has to be our litmus test.
Thank you, Alison. I certainly like this idea of certification of data flows. We have a few minutes left, so I want to pivot to questions from the audience. If you have any questions, please either put your hand up or place it in chat. But we already have some questions that came in when folks registered for this webinar, and I'll start with you. Ridwan and potentially kind of lump some of these questions together. So there's a question around, well, how do you develop the architecture for data embassies such that they're immune to political influence? And another one connected to, well, if you have these data embassies, what prevents host country or operator first access, and what kind of minimum assurance mechanisms should governments require, such as, independent audits, tamper evidence logs, and the like. Some of these things already spoke to in your earlier remarks, but do you want to address those directly again?
I mean, what I'll just say quickly is that, the whole idea of diplomatic invulnerability is the baseline, not even the ceiling at all. It's like where the conversation starts. And maybe what I would say is also how, if this model start emerging on the continent, can sub-regional bodies, can the African Union be like a guarantor of trust in that sense? And we've seen where, for example, success where sub-regional bodies have been able to do with disputes within member states. And we've also seen failures where they've also not been able to solve this problem. But with digital data embassy, for example, it's a different brand of problem, which means, yes, of course, a treaty or the agreement is establishing that, an attack on the host, on that kind of data, for example, is a declaration of war, is an act of aggression. But are these sub-regional bodies, is there a mechanism to guarantee that can trigger, the political pressure that can force the hand of the government that has done so to actually reverse such decision? So we also need to think about that. And when we move this conversation to what success have we seen in conflicts? Look at ECOWAS, for example. Few countries have been able to exit simply because that was cool. Now we have like the whole alliance of the Sahel states. What political lever do we have, to be able to force changes like that? So this is the same conversation we're going to have even when we talk about data center. We need to reimagine it and not get too excited about the potential it offers us. So what political levers do we have to solve those problems? Definitely one. But also, I think I've spoken extensively on, the technical workaround where you also make it technically impossible. And it's why, if you look at conversation around encryption globally, it's why you see civil society never supports anything around backdoor encryption. It's like the last refuge. So can we have something like this where cryptographically we make it also impossible for even the data, to have a meaningful access to the data? Again, we need to imagine this conversation alongside developments like, quantum computing. How soon is it going to be accessible? And now maybe, in 10, 20 years, for example, these whole concepts might probably also just fall apart. But that's something that needs to be, thought about long term, short term, even in medium term. And I think the last thing I really want to say is about how this could also be like a really good solution to data transfer. Because again, under data embassy model, under the immunity model, you're not having data transfer at all, because it's basically, the data simply enjoys the same immunity the embassy will enjoy. So there is no transfer happening in that sense. It's just, so we don't have to worry about mechanism. We don't have to worry about all of those things. And I think it's a really exciting concept that will be really good to see, how well it's managed. Some of the examples that we've seen in other parts of the world too. When it gets challenged, how would they deal with it? Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Ridwan. And for you, Alison, there's a question about whether South Africa's current data governance, landscape in terms of policies, in terms of laws, are sufficient considering the adoption of emerging technologies such as AI. Nothing that, you were with the information regulator of South Africa. I'm pretty sure you've got quite a few things to say about this.
Well, I think, I think if you remember that a lot of the legislation was drafted when we still had dial-up modems, we used photocopiers, it was considered very advanced if you had a website. It would be silly of me to try and suggest that our frameworks and our legislative frameworks in particular are fully current. And I think both the the access to information legislation, as well as the protection of personal information legislation, need updating. We don't have an AI law, and I'm yet to see a draft. I'm yet to even see a particular department putting out a draft bill, for example, which would give you a sense of things moving. So I think that we are far further behind than really we should be. And I think the other thing that you have to look at in terms of enforcement, and I mean we've talked about this as a problem across the continent. It's as much a problem in South Africa of just insufficient regulatory muscle, insufficient staff, insufficient training. Our judicial training program does not involve training in these areas, and I think that that's absolutely essential if you're going to have good decisions from judges. You really want that to be off the back of understanding where this area is going. So I think there's a range of areas that need improvement, and I would hope that gets acted on sooner rather than later. But as always with these things, legislation, even with you really, a really dedicated campaign behind it, is often a matter of years in the making. So the fact that we're not, out of the gate with some legislation, even in draft, is indicates that it's going to be some time yet before we get there.
Thank you so much, Alison and Ridwan. Really appreciate these insights. There are a couple of other questions which I think we probably won't have time to get to. So there's one about how we balance scaling up in hybrid versus local on continent infrastructure. Another one on, well, for African data that is already out of the continent, how do we gain control of that? I think given we're at time, my recommendation to folks who've been gracious enough to attend this webinar is please, have a read at the paper that Ridwan posted. It answers some of these questions we didn't get to. I've posted the link to that paper in the chat, and hopefully some of the answers to your questions can be found in this piece. Again, thank you so much everyone for attending this important conversation, and we're grateful again to Alison and Ridwan for granting us your expertise and time. Really grateful, and hope you have a lovely day, everyone.
Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure.
Cheers.